Welcome back. This is the Vantage Point, getting out and above the fray, the madness, to get a fresh perspective, a fresh set of eyes, looking at things from a different perspective, a different angle. Sometimes we need that. A matter of fact, I can honestly say that I am not the same person I used to be 5 years ago, 10 years ago. I keep moving forward, and I keep expanding the way I think and the way I feel. And I don't default back to some pattern, whether it's Republican, Democrat, other Green Party pattern that exists, and you have to do that. Now, Popeye, this is an interesting article. This article killed me when I saw it today. This is really the brave new world Aldous Huxley was talking about. Bipolar kids, victims of the madness industry. This article breaks down how the entire psychiatric, and pharmaceutical industry is a sham, as it was created by one person and who didn't know his ass from hole in the ground. But this one from New Scientist, it says here, there's a children's book in the U.S. called Brandon and the Bipolar Bear. Brandon and his bear sometimes fly into unprovoked rages. Sometimes they're silly and overexcited. A nice doctor tells them that they're ill and gives them medicine that makes them feel better. Ooh, it's propaganda. Thing is, if Brendan was a real child, he would have been misdiagnosed with bipolar disorder, also known as manic depression. The serious condition involves dramatic mood swings, is increasingly being recorded in American citizens, children, and a vast number of them being medicated for it. It says the problem is this apparent epidemic isn't real. Bipolar emerges from late adolescence, says Ian Goodyear, a professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Cambridge, who studies child and adolescent depression. It is very, very unlikely indeed that you'll find it in children under 7 years old. And it says here, it talks about this particular person, Robert Spitzer, who came up with the idea of all these different diagnoses. Says, I met Spitzer in his large, airy house in Princeton, New Jersey, in his 80s now. He remembered his childhood camping trips to upstate New York. I'd sit in the tent looking out, writing notes about lady campers. He said, their attributes. He smiled. I've always liked to classify people, he says. The trips were a respite from Spitzer's very unhappy mother in the 1940s. The only help on offer was psychoanalysis, the Freudian-based approach to exploring the patient's unconscious. She went from one psychoanalyst to another, said Spitzer. He watched psychoanalysts flailing uselessly. She never got better. Spitzer grew up to be a psychiatrist at Columbia University in New York. His dislike of psychoanalysis remained undimmed. And then in 1973, an opportunity to change everything presented itself. There was a job for editing the next edition of a little-known spiral-bound notebook called DSM. This is famous, this book. The Diagnosis and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Now, it says here, for years Spitzer held editorial meetings at Columbia. They were chaos. The psychiatrists would yell out the names of potential new disorders and the checklist of their symptoms. Just checklist, nothing more.
I have a copy of that manual, the psychiatric disorder, like the list of them. It's a huge gray book. It's like twice the size of a phone book.
Yeah. Basically they're just running and creating disorders and going down a checklist of symptoms. Like really no 5-10 year study. It looks like this. That's what it is. He says here, there would be voices of dissent or assent or dissent. The loudest voices getting listened to the most. If Spitzer agreed with those proposing new diagnoses, he would almost always did. He'd hammer it out instantly on an old typewriter, and they would be set in stone. Oh yeah, he just decides. Says that's how practically every disorder you've ever heard or been diagnosed with came to be defined. Post-traumatic stress disorder, said Spitzer, attention deficit disorder, autism, anorexia, nervosa, bulimia, panic disorder, each with its own checklist of symptoms that he just decided. And he says here, we were going to include masochistic personality disorder. He meant battered wives who stay with their husband. That's a disorder now. Not because they possibly love them or don't want to leave, but that they have a disorder.
It's not a disorder. They're just dumb. And if you're going to classify women that stay with an abusive husband a disorder, then I guess everybody in this country has a disorder because the government is like an abusive husband.
Yes, we all have a disorder. We
all have a disorder. They work for the abusive husband. So I guess you have a disorder too, buddy. That's a stupid statement.
Yeah, and that is a true deal for what's going on in this industry. It says DSM-3 was a sensation. It sold over 1 million copies, many more copies than there were psychiatrists. Millions of people began using the checklist to diagnose themselves. Oh, self-diagnosis. I'm sure that would go well. For many years, it was a godsend. Something was categorically wrong with them, and finally their suffering had a name. It was truly a revolution in psychiatry. It says it was a gold rush for drug companies, which suddenly had 83 new disorders they could invent medicines for. The pharmaceuticals were delighted with DSM, Spitzer told me, and this in turn delighted him. I love to hear parents who say it was impossible for me to live with him until we gave him the medication, and then it was night and day. Spitzer's successor, the psychiatrist named Alan Francis, continued the tradition of welcoming new mental disorders with their corresponding checklists into the fold. His DSM-4 came with a mammoth 886 pages with an extra 32 mental disorders. It says, it talks about how, parents dealing with children. It says, one condition Francis considered a mistake was childhood bipolar disorder. Kids with extreme temper tantrums are being called bipolar. He said childhood bipolar takes the edge of guilt away from parents, and maybe they created an oppositional child. Or maybe they just gave the child too many medications. Here, take a medication, shut the hell up. And they've created a brand new industry to fleece people, Popeye.
Oh, dude, I mean, how many parents do you see nowadays? They don't even, I'm going to put my kid in the corner for timeout. I didn't get timeout. I had what was called time's up. Okay? you crossed the line and that was it. There was no you're in the corner for timeout. You got your rear end handed to you right there. If you were in public, didn't matter. My mother grew up in Europe post World War II. She was born in 1948. My father was born a few years before that, and he grew up here. He grew up during the war in the United States. They grew up in a very different era. My father didn't mouth off to his father. My mother didn't mouth off to her father or her mother. It wasn't like that. Nowadays you get these kids, they walk around and they're like, F you, Mom, F you, Dad.
Yeah.
These parents, they don't do anything. And I'm like, if that were my kid, his teeth would be out of his face.
It would never happen. Or hell, it would never happen.
Honestly, it would never happen. There wouldn't be any need for me backhanding the kid across the mouth because
he'd know better.
Yeah, they would have respect for me. Honestly, that's the fact about it is they don't have respect for their parents. And if they don't have respect for their parents, Mike, they're not going to have respect for any of their elders or any seniors or anybody.
For no one.
That's from the school.
Well, look, think about this. I've seen in kids these days where they just look at people and they can figure out how to manipulate them into getting what they want. They talk to their parents any kind of way. They roll temper tantrums. They hit their own parents. I mean, these people are crazy. But here's an example of how, like you said, the parents give these kids medicine just to shut the hell up. It says on the night of Thursday, December 2006, 13th December 2006, in Boston, Massachusetts, a 4-year-old Rebecca Riley had a cold and couldn't sleep. Her mother, Carolyn Riley, gave her some cold medication and then some of her bipolar medication. Oh, yeah, that was smart. And told her she could sleep on the floor next to the bed. When she tried to wake Rebecca the next morning, she discovered the daughter was dead. The autopsy revealed that Rebecca's parents had given her an overdose of the antipsychotic drugs she had been prescribed for her bipolar disorder. They had gotten to the habit of feeding her medicines to shut her up when she was being annoying. And then they both convicted of Rebecca's murder. It's just ridiculous. But of course, now they're going to throw out the bipolar disorder for kids now because they can't prove it.
Well, see, I have someone that's close to me that is bipolar, or what they would call it. She's not really bipolar. Or what they would consider her is like on the lower end of the spectrum, which is like manic depressive, and she's more manic than anything else. She requires one thing to keep her okay. She just requires a mood stabilizer. But she's in her 30s. Okay, and she was not diagnosed until she was in her teens, and I learned all about it. And what the guy said about it being fake is true, because people don't develop it until they're in their teens, and usually by their mid-30s, it almost goes away to a point. So this whole thing about children, that's like when I was a kid, the big thing was Ritalin. You know, if your kid thought outside the box, Mike, that was it. He had ADHD.
Yeah, man. Hang on, we're going to bring this back and talk about us. You Fred and watching, and we'll bring you back on, man. Stick around as we wrap it up. VantagePointRadio.com.